Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on REACH authorization and the aerospace supply chain, hosted by Workgroup 5 of the International Aerospace Environmental Group. My name is Tom Pertich and I am facilitating the running of the event today. I'm now going to pass over to Phil Humphreys, Chair of Workgroup 5, who will say a few words before we play to you a 30-minute presentation that we have prepared. This will be followed by a question and answer session with a group of expert panelists that are on the line. So Phil, over to you.
Hello everyone. As Tom said, my name is Phil Humphreys and I am the leader of IAG Workgroup 5 on REACH authorization. And I will be acting as moderator for this webinar. Before we start, I'd like to take the opportunity to explain who we are and why we're running this event. A number of aerospace companies have been involved with recent REACH authorization applications and have experienced consortium membership. As a result of this experience, we recognise that there may be a need in the future for authorization applications that are more aerospace focused, and that we may need to actually instigate consortia authorizations ourselves. As a result, we formed a work group in IAG to develop what we call a toolbox of processes, standard dossier content, standard consortium agreements, and lists of service providers that any workgroup member could either use in the future to launch a consortium or maybe take with them when joining somebody else's consortium. And these tools then give a consistent industry message to be included in any future authorization applications. We also decided to proactively investigate market analysis of substances that are key to our industry in advance of any decision to include them onto Annex 14 of REACH. We're doing this so we can understand the uses in our industry and where we fit in the overall uses globally. We also seek to understand how the development of alternatives is progressing. This webinar is actually the first stage of that process and is a precursor to a supply chain survey that will shortly follow. It's designed to give an overview of the authorization process and explain the requirements of an authorization and where different actors in the supply chain fit in the process. I'm afraid there are elements that you may consider too detailed for your own specific needs, but I ask you to recognise that we are presenting to a wide range of companies with different potential levels of involvement with REACH. Before we commence the presentation, I do though need to point out that we would like you to submit questions as they occur to you during the presentation. Okay? We all have to comply with competition law. To that end, I need to take you through the IAG guidance related to your obligations when submitting questions during this session. So, the Q&A session in this webinar must be conducted in compliance with the competition laws and IAG compliance program, including, without limitation, the following guidelines. All questions and or comments addressed during this webinar are related to this webinar, and they shall not suggest or facilitate discussions on prices or pricing policy or other restraints on competition of any kind, including but not limited to trading terms with any customer or supplier, stock levels, volumes, or sales figures. They shall not engage in discussions that could lead to a boycott of a supplier or customer. They shall not encourage or facilitate any attempt to divide customers, restrict products, sales conditions, or in any way alter the business of another participant or the IAG members. Participants shall not discuss or suggest any form of coordinated reaction to customers or to other suppliers. Participants shall not refer to a particular customer or supplier by name, or to refer to any information that allows the identification of a company or the identification of a business relationship between an IAG member and a supplier or customer. Participants shall not exchange any information that allows them to identify a company's competitive information, including pricing and strategic planning. Any questions and or comment made by a participant shall be made in a form that prevents the identification of that participant or its business relation as a supplier or business partner of any of the IAG members. None of the questions shall include export-controlled information or any participant or third-party proprietary information. None of the answers or comments provided during the Q&A session constitutes legal advice The IAEG does not make any representations or warranties with respect to the information presented or the opinion or comments made during the Q&A session. Any particular concern related to the information presented in this webinar should be reviewed with your own legal counsel. I should also add that all the questions you submit go to our independent consultants who vet them for compliance before they actually forward them on to myself. So I'll now invite Tom Persic from RPA to explain how you can submit questions during the webinar. Tom.
Thanks very much, Phil. So submitting questions should be a reasonably straightforward process for you. There should actually already be a questions box on your screen that has opened, but if it hasn't, you can click on the small red arrow on the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that should bring the questions box out. So we're now going to proceed with today's presentation.
Hi everybody, my name's Kathy Phillips. Welcome to today's webinar setting out some of the key concepts of the REACH authorization process and also giving an insight into preparatory activities being undertaken by the International Aerospace Environment Group, the IAEG. This presentation will run for about 30 minutes. It will be followed by a question and answer session with the aim to finish up within an hour. We've had some pre-submitted questions which we'll answer, and also as participants you're able to submit questions during the webinar using the question box on the screen. You may also like to know that a recording of the webinar along with all the slides will soon be available on the IAEG website. So without further ado, let's get started. So, why should you be listening today? Well, over the course of this webinar, we will provide an overview of the REACH authorization procedure following the journey a substance will take, the typical timescales, and the resource requirements from your perspective as a business. We will discuss the various practicalities of submitting an application for authorization from different points of view within the supply chain. We'll highlight the information required in an application for authorization, and we're going to try and keep that reasonably concise. But we might well follow up with another webinar that will go into additional detail if there's an appetite for that. We will explain the challenges facing the aerospace sector, which are rather unique in many aspects, and we're sure it will ring true with many of you. And finally, we will outline the efforts that IAEG is taking to plan for potential future REACH authorization requirements, and also identify how you can participate to help ensure that your own uses of substances of concern are properly considered. Now, before we go into these details, we're first going to tell you who IAEG are, and in particular, highlight the activities of Working Group 5 on authorization. So, who are we? The International Aerospace Environment Group, or IAEG, is a trade association that was formed in 2011 by a group of major aerospace companies. IAEG's vision is to advance innovative environmental solutions for the aerospace industry, and IAEG is the leading global aerospace forum for sharing good practices on key issues and developing voluntary consensus standards around the environment sphere. The group focuses on a multitude of global laws and regulations, which are often highly complex and variable, and REACH is one of these. More generally, IAEG seeks to drive continual improvement in the processes used throughout the industry. So, at a glance, our organisational structure of IAEG consists of a board of directors and, at present, 8 working groups. Each of these have been established to address separate environmental issues. Today's webinar has been organised by Working Group 5, who focus specifically on REACH authorisation activities. So just to give a little more detail, Working Group 5's mission is to create a body of knowledge and expertise in the international aerospace industry that will collaboratively work to support REACH authorization activities for global business continuity. Working Group 5 also has the objective to facilitate the creation of authorization consortia of businesses for the benefit of the aerospace industry by establishing a structure, a process, tools and supporting expertise that can be repeatedly used as we need them. So, what is the authorization procedure? The authorization procedure is described in Title 7 of the European Union's REACH regulation. It's one of the core processes under REACH for managing risks of hazardous substances. It exists to ensure risks from substances of very high concern, SVHCs, are properly controlled, and that these substances are progressively replaced by suitable alternatives without introducing unwanted disruptions to the functioning of the internal market. Another way of saying this is that it aims to ensure that alternatives are implemented, but only when they can be considered both technically and economically feasible. So substances are added to the authorization list via a two-step process. First, a member state from the European Economic Area or the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, initially proposes that an SVHC be added to the candidate list for authorization. In the second step, a substance might be included in the authorization list itself. Such substances that are on the second list cannot be placed on the market or used in Europe after the so-called sunset date unless an authorization has been granted for a specific use or the use has been exempted from authorization. At present, in January 2017, the authorization list contains 31 substances and the candidate list contains 173 substances. All authorization decisions will define a time-limited review period. Now, typically, these have been 4, 7 or 12 years, and holders of authorizations must submit a review report at least 18 months before this review period ends if they want their uses to continue. In addition to this, an authorization may be reviewed at any time if the circumstances of the authorization use changes or if new information or potential alternatives become available. So just to recap on how a substance makes its way onto the authorization list. Here's a diagram documenting the two-step process discussed on the previous slide. Now, many more additions to the authorization list are expected, some imminently, and due to the two-step nature of the process, we're also able to track the journey a substance will take. Considering timescales, the period from the submission of the Annex 15 dossier, which proposes that a substance becomes a substance of very high concern, until inclusion in the candidate list, which is the first step, usually takes between 5 to 10 months. From inclusion in the candidate list, there is no set time under which a substance has to move to the authorization list, and many may never do so. Instead, substances are prioritized, and that's based on criteria set out by REACH, which states that priority shall normally be given to substances with the highlighted levels of concern when it comes to their human health and environmental properties, along with the nature and volume of their use. In essence, the purpose of the prioritization is to ensure that the most relevant substances are included in Annex 14 before the less relevant substances. Now, where your company sits in the supply chain will dictate the role that you might wish to have in an application for authorization. It affects different companies in different ways. A manufacturer, an importer, or a downstream user of a substance on the authorization list may prepare an application for authorization for its own uses or for the uses for which they intend to place the substance on the EU market. And only representative of a non-EU manufacturer can also submit an application. So, if a manufacturer or an importer applies, the authorization can cover the manufacturer or importer's downstream uses of the substance for its customer base. Therefore, these types of upstream applications have a full top-down coverage. That also makes them rather broad and quite complicated. Now, if a downstream user applies, the situation is different, and the authorization will have limited coverage. It'll cover the applicant, its customers down the supply chain who may purchase the substance or formulations from the applicant, and its immediate supplier, one level up in the supply chain, if this supplier is only placing the substance on the market and not using the substance themselves, for example in formulation activities. A downstream user cannot therefore cover its actors up its supply chain other than the substance manufacturer or the importer if they are its immediate supplier. In terms of coverage, distributors don't need to be considered in the authorization chain as they're not substance users. However, they do have a role to play between manufacturers and customers in enabling communication in the supply chain. Under REACH and CLP definitions, it's important to bear in mind that you are not a distributor if you buy chemicals from outside the European Economic Area, EEA, and place them straight on the market in the EEA. In this instance, you're the importer. If you buy chemicals within the EEA and mix them with other chemicals, dilute them or fill containers before supplying them to others, then you're a downstream user, not a distributor, and your own formulation activities may need to be covered in an application for authorization. For complex supply chains such as aerospace, in terms of coverage, authorization works best when upstream suppliers make the applications, but this requires significant input from formulators, end users, and original equipment manufacturers for this to be a success. We've figured out who may be applying for authorization. So what will they have to submit? There are three core components within an application for authorization. These are the Chemical Safety Report, the CSR, the Analysis of Alternatives, the AOA, and the SocioEconomic Analysis, the SEA. The SCA, the Socioeconomic Analysis, is not always a mandatory requirement, but in practice should always be provided because the information in it really helps. A CSR prepared to support an application for authorization under REACH is different from a CSR in a REACH registration dossier in several respects. A REACH registration dossier tends to evolve, but under the current authorization procedure, there is only one opportunity to secure acceptance of the submitted CSR. Therefore, the authorization CSR should meet all expectations of ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee in order to be successful, and should be able to demonstrate low exposure levels and consequently low risks. An authorization CSR contains the hazard part, addressing the critical effects that have led to the Annex 14 listing of the substance in the first place, and also an exposure evaluation and risk characterization for the uses. Low risks provide good arguments in the cost-benefit analysis that's required to be carried out in the socioeconomic analysis. So essentially, the lower the risk, the easier it is to argue that health risks are low in compared to the benefits from the continued use of the substance. Now, it's also worth mentioning that the ECHA Risk Assessment Committee, the RAC, has a strong preference for measured data in its dossier. So if you're applying as a downstream user, there's going to be fewer companies in your authorization. The information is going to be easier to collect. If we're considering an upstream application, well-described examples of representative workplaces downstream will be required, backed up by real measurements from downstream user companies covered by the authorization. The analysis of alternatives is also critical and a compulsory part of any application for authorization. And in order to attain authorization, an applicant must demonstrate that no technically feasible, economically feasible, or suitable alternative is in existence. There are none. There are three main parts of analysis of alternatives. First, the analysis of substance function, where the technical criteria that an alternative must fulfill is defined. The second is the identification of possible alternatives, where it's necessary to document your historic substitution efforts prior to today and your current substitution efforts. And finally, the assessment of suitability of alternatives, where all aspects of feasibility associated with the implementation of the most promising alternatives are explored. So where the analysis of alternatives looks primarily at the applicant's situation, in contrast, the socioeconomic analysis considers the entire supply chain. The point of the SCA is to show that the socioeconomic benefits from continued use outweigh the risks to human health and the environment across the big picture. This is achieved by comparing the applied for use scenario, so business as usual, to the non-use scenarios, which is a description of what could happen after a refused authorization. Now, of course, there might well be more than one scenario, depending on the options that are being considered. The scenarios need to be realistic and justified and should reflect the results of the analysis on the technical feasibility, economic feasibility, and availability of alternatives. This all sounds pretty complicated, and well, it is. And another important point to note is that REACH authorization is proving to be a constantly evolving process because it's complicated, and we're learning as we go. ECHA provides a number of templates and guidance materials in relation to authorization. These can also change, and aspects of them can become obsolete, and this is the case for some of the information in the original guidance documents, which were produced back in 2011. Another example concerns the analysis of alternatives and socioeconomic analysis, which were initially developed separately, but can now be developed in a joint document following a slightly different approach. Also, we earlier mentioned that authorization review periods are typically set to 4, 7, and 12 years. There have been recently some deliberations regarding whether a review period that's longer than this can be granted based on particular criteria. The ECHA Committee's approach to evaluating applications is also evolving. At the present time, the committees are producing decision trees to streamline their opinion development processes, and ECHA also holds regular workshops relating to key authorization issues. ECHA also regularly publishes questions and answers in relation to key authorization issues, and these can, for example, clarify the validity of potential exemptions. So the message to take home from this is that given the development of an application can take a considerable length of time, it's really important that applicants keep on top of developments and have a good grasp of the current best practice methods. By now, we've established that authorization is a fairly complicated process. From a business perspective, it requires complete supply chain and product content knowledge, as well as the need to know where all substances used in your activities originate. Authorization also requires businesses to make strategic decisions, and we can usually identify 5 different strategies that you can follow. You could replace the substance with a suitable alternative or adapt your process to avoid its use. You can switch to products, articles, that avoid the use of the substance in the first place. You can consider applying for an authorization, or you can ensure that your use is covered by another authorization by somebody else in your supply chain, or you can cease use in the European Union. Companies really need to weigh up the pros and cons of these options, and to do it properly, it's vitally important to prepare in good time. It's particularly the case for the aerospace sector, where we have a number of complicating factors that mean that the need for authorization is often quite great, and the process itself also presents some particular challenges. We'll now look at these challenges in more detail. First and foremost, the industry does depend on many SPHCs in order to meet functional requirements. Airworthiness and safety are a top priority, and high-performance materials and formulations must be used. The safety-critical nature of the industry, in turn, means that any changes to product require substantive evidence of compliance with standards, and even if achievable, that can take many years. Also, the volume of use of the SPHCs might not be particularly high when considering the overall market for that SPHC. Therefore, thinking from the perspective of the raw materials suppliers, the aerospace sector might not always be a top priority when it comes to authorization. As a consequence, the industry itself must take proactive steps to ensure relevant uses can continue. Another really important issue is the complex nature of aerospace supply chains. There's likely to be multiple downstream uses of a particular SPHC. The nature of uses can be highly variable, and given the many tiers in aerospace supply chains, the level of visibility is often quite poor. As we've already discussed, not every actor in the supply chain can apply for an authorization. If we now think about the potential for an upstream application, before we even get to the information required for the CSR, the AOA and the SCA, we need to know, what are the uses? Are potential alternatives available? Are they feasible? How long will they take to implement? Could they be implemented before the sunset date? Who should apply for authorization? The situation is further complicated, as not every actor in the supply chain will have the same commercial interests. It's these issues that really relate to the activities that Working Group 5 is undertaking. Essentially, we're making efforts to better understand the situation within the supply chain using certain SPHCs. These activities are critical to understanding the vulnerability of downstream user groups to the loss of a key substance, and to identifying strategies to minimize that vulnerability and increase supply chain resilience. We'll now go into these activities in a little more detail, but we'd first like to highlight that despite the challenges the industry faces, there's also a clear opportunity to provide very good argumentation in applications for authorization. So, for example, the intense, timely and costly procedure for implementing potential alternatives means that we'll often tick many of the boxes that warrant the receipt of a long review period. It's also worth mentioning that many of the factors we discussed have been explored in some detail in a 2014 collaboration by ECHA and the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, and the front cover of which you can see on the slide, and this report is available on the ECHA website. IAEG Working Group 5 are planning for potential future REACH authorization requirements. To do this, supply chain mapping is critical, as it helps us to identify issues which might not be immediately apparent. It helps us set up communication and potential collaboration channels across affected parts of industry. At present, we're following a 6-step approach. Steps 1 and 2 are essentially the supply chain profiling of substances, as well as an initial assessment of uses. Here we're really going back to basics and putting together straightforward use lists and setting out an initial supply chain map. This way, we should be on the right footing moving forward and trying to gather more complex information about uses. Step 3 is where we get into the detail of developing the supply chain map for the particular substances of concern. And in steps 4, 5 and 6, we're getting to grips with the risks posed by the potential authorization listing for a certain substance, figuring out how these risks can be mitigated most effectively. So here we're looking into potential alternatives as well as vulnerabilities with respect to supply chain continuity and how that can be affected by the authorization. For example, will the importer continue to import it? And if not, what can we do about it? In order to do this, we need data. The most important information we need is from consultations done by a third-party consultant in order to obtain a direct views of key actors within the supply chain. And that's probably you. With regard to specific substances of concern, at present, our consultants are undertaking a supply chain survey for cadmium compounds. As you may be aware, several cadmium compounds are currently on the European Chemical Agency's candidate list for authorization. Now, although none of the substances have yet been recommended for inclusion in Annex 14, their use in a wide range of critical aerospace applications is well established, and that includes metal finishing, as an alloying element, and as a pigment in plastic that's used in high temperature applications. With regard to the format of the survey, we're disseminating an initial and follow-up questionnaire. The initial questionnaire focuses on basic information concerning company classification, use verification, and ensuring we've got correct follow-on contact details. And it shouldn't take more than 10 minutes to complete. Now, the follow-up questionnaire is slightly more detailed with approximately 10 questions and will focus on the identification of particular uses and their associated parameters. All the information reported back to us by our consultants will be presented in a confidential manner, and by this way we mean that responses will be aggregated and that Working Group 5 will not be able to link information back to individual respondents to protect your IPR. So we hope you've now gained a good understanding of the journey a substance will take onto Annex 14, as well as the challenges facing the aerospace sector and the efforts that IEEG is taking to plan for potential future REACH authorization requirements. We really cannot overemphasize how important it is for us to obtain your support in completing and passing on the short questionnaires that we'll be distributing throughout the supply chain, sending your way. Of course, the more information we receive, the better we'll be able to determine the key issues, and this will benefit us all in ensuring that any eventual approach to authorization is well informed and based on sound information. We'd like to highlight that there's also a more direct benefit for companies that respond to our questionnaires, as you'll be sent a summary of our report conclusions, as well as a fact sheet to help keep you up to date on the latest developments for cadmium initially. One final point we would like to make is that if you're based outside the EU, authorizations may still matter to you, and your survey input is also very important. For example, if you're based in the United States, but export formulations containing a substance on Annex 14 into the EU, and the uses inside the EU are likely to require authorization, this could well present a business risk to you, and this survey can help. Only by working together can we overcome the challenges that are presented by authorization.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to the presentation, and I'm now going to pass over to Phil again, who's going to kick off the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Tom, and my thanks go to Kathy Phillips from Rolls-Royce, whose voice you just heard giving that presentation. We'll now go into the Q&A session, but before we do, I need to remind you all of the compliance requirements, which we will leave on the screen throughout. We have a number of industry experts as panelists today. So from our technical consultants, RPA Limited, we have Meg Postal and Panos Sarogiannis. Then from the IAEG members, we have Kathy Phillips, our HSE specialist for supply chain, Dave Billings and Mark Bitar. For chemical regulations, Helen Middleton. Engineering and materials, we have Erin Yeager, Stefan Gados and Laura Wilkinson. And for legal compliance, we have Kathleen McFadden, Lisbeth Rea and Sturla Olsen. Right, I shall now go on to the questions. And the first question, can you recap on the current status of cadmium and cadmium compounds? What is their potential timeline for inclusion in Annex 14? And I think we will pose that one to RPA as our consultant.
Okay, thank you very much, Phil. This is Meg Postal speaking. Cadmium, cadmium chloride, cadmium fluoride, cadmium oxide, cadmium sulfate, and cadmium sulfide are all on the candidate list right now. None have been recommended yet for inclusion in Annex 14 of REACH, the so-called authorization list, and there is no fixed period by when a decision has to be made on their inclusion. As indicated in the presentation, ECHA recommends substances for inclusion on the authorization list based on criteria set out in REACH. These are the criteria with regard to PBTs, persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity, very persistent, very bioaccumulative, criteria on wide dispersive use, and then high volumes of use. ECHA's recommendations on substances that should be prioritized for authorization are submitted to the Commission. Before they submit any recommendation to the Commission, ECHA launches a public consultation, though, which lasts for 90 days. The IAEG is very active in responding to those consultations, but you also can respond to those consultations. Once a substance is recommended by ECHA, the process to inclusion in Annex 14 list is expected to take about 14 months, but in reality it can take much longer. And indeed, there have been recommendations, the 5th and 6th recommendation, where inclusion on the list is still outstanding for substances on those initial recommendations. There are also other cadmium compounds on the regulatory agenda. Cadmium carbonate, cadmium hydroxide, and cadmium nitrate are currently the subject of what are called risk management options analyses by the Swedish authorities. Although these analyses are not binding, there is the potential for the outcome of them to lead to SVHC recommendations. I think that covers it, Phil.
Thank you, Meg. Right, next one. As a user of cadmium, is there anything I need to be doing now? Kathy.
Answer the IAEG survey. So if you monitor workplace exposure of workers to cadmium and its compounds, then for each of your uses, then start collecting that data, start collating it, putting it all together. Include any biological monitoring if you have it, and take out any personal data from records that you might need to share. So you've got a sanitized version that you can share. And survey your uses and document your control measures. So basically put all that information together, ready for use. Back to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Okay, next question. Isn't it the responsibility of the substance manufacturers to make sure our uses are covered? Supply chain one. David.
Thanks, Phil. In aerospace, as in many other industries, supply chains can be long and very complex. So without speaking to your customers and your suppliers, there's absolutely no guarantee that your uses are going to be covered. Even if you only use a substance because your customer specifies it, you need to open lines of communication with both your upstream and downstream customers and suppliers. You just cannot rely on somebody else managing your business risk for you. It's also important to make sure that the substance manufacturers have sight not just of your uses themselves, but of any socioeconomic information or exposure data or information on alternatives that you might have and might be specific to you. All of these can be critical to the success of an authorization.
Thank you, Dave. Right, the next question. How will I know that my use of cadmium substances is covered by my upstream supply chain, and what obligations will I have towards my customers? Sounds like you again, Dave.
Yeah, it's a very similar question, and therefore an answer to the previous one, really. Communication is key. You can't make any assumptions about what's happening upstream or downstream of wherever you may be. Your business risk is your own, so you need to make sure that your specific uses and conditions are included in any authorization applications being made. Regarding obligations after an authorization is granted, you may be obliged to comply with any requirements associated with the decision from ECHA. This includes any risk management measures listed in the chemical safety report and any conditions separately imposed by the authorization decision. Finally, you might need to communicate or you probably will need to be able to communicate the authorization number to your customers downstream and confirm with ECHA on your first use of the substance after authorization. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Dave. One hot off the press here. If one of our customers, A, receives authorization for use of an SV8C to one of their customers, can we use that authorization to sell to customer A? I think we'll point that RPA's way. I think that one.
Can you repeat the question, please?
If one of our customers, in bracket A, receives authorization for use of an SV8C to one of their customers, can we use that authorization to sell to customer A? There's an interesting one.
Okay, so customer A has an authorization, and you're the supplier of customer A. Am I understanding this right, Phil?
I think so. I think it is a case of they supply to somebody who has an authorization and they supply to somebody else. Now, my thoughts on that, Meg, would be if that authorization also covers the supplier's uses, then they would be covered by the authorization. Am I right?
Well, it's got to be within the supply chain, because the authorization, if the customer has it and the supplier is importing it in or whatever, then, or the manufacturer, then that supplier is covered, but not for an alternative supply chain. He's covered for customer A's supply chain because customer A is effectively providing him with the justification for the supply in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It goes back to the slide that had the three different sets of who can act as a supplier on it.
Right. If I can see who asked the question. If that doesn't answer it for you, if you want to email the question into Tom Persic, we will get you a more complete answer. But if you do, could you just expand on it a little to give them more of an idea of exactly what you mean?
Yeah, we're more than happy to answer the question for you.
Right, the next question. Will an authorization be required if cadmium compounds are added to Annex 14, even though there are certain derogations listed in entry 23 of Annex 17? Sorry, Meg, that's over to you again.
That's Panos Zarjanis from RPA. If the if there is a derogation, I think there is always the possibility that the derogation will require an authorization. I'm not entirely sure what the derogations are being referred to here are, but potentially, okay, if the derogation is being taken into account at the time of the substance being added to the authorization list, it will be specifically exempt from authorization.
Yeah.
If the entry to the authorization list does not describe the specific derogation, then that use needs to be authorized. The suggestion would be obviously the ECA committees, when they are discussing the listing of the substance, the commission rather, discussing the listing of the substance on Annex 14, they need to be made aware very clearly of the importance of these derogations to take them into account and potentially introduce an exemption. But if an exemption is not specifically mentioned, then an authorization will be required.
This is one of the reasons for responding to any consultation that ECA has before it makes its recommendations to the Commission. So if you see a public consultation on a substance that you use, then you really need to feed information into that consultation.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that answers that question. The next question, I'm actually not going to read out because it's about chromium 6, and this is a webinar about cadmium. However, if the person who actually put that down again wants to send it in, we can give a better explanation directly to them. The next one, we are a user. Oops, excuse me. Just clicked a little too far on the screen. Bear with me one moment. There we go. We are a user of cadmium compounds. You say that we should be contacting our suppliers and customers, but who exactly should we be talking to, and what do we need to communicate to them? Who wants to answer that one?
I'll have a step further. I think it's a good question. Often it depends who you speak to at a customer or a supplier as to what answer you're going to get. So if at all possible, it's worth trying to track down the person responsible for REACH compliance. In smaller size companies, that may be HS&E, health and safety, or quality. But the larger companies may have their own REACH or regulatory compliance department that you should talk to. But I guess the simplest answer here is to respond to any questionnaires which may come your way.
Thanks, Dave. We have a health and safety question. Do you have any comments or insight into additional health and safety conditions that may be required by a particular authorization?
Yes. When we're ready to submit an authorization, the requirements the information we put into the CSR will be the things that will define at the end of the day what the requirements are. That together with the recommendations that we get back from the various committees and that will potentially become requirements of authorization. So for cadmium, we've got some idea based on what we've learned from hexavalent chrome. So for cadmium, the current workplace exposure limit is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, 8-hour time weighted average. Sorry if it's all a bit technical. Now that's half what we've got for hexavalent chrome. And we don't know what the requirement for exposure limit will be for cadmium, but we should expect something around the limit of detection because that's what we've got for hexavalent chrome. So we've got for hex chrome, it's going from 50 down to 2. For cadmium, it's currently 25 micrograms per meter cubed, we should expect it to go down to whatever you can measure cadmium to. I'm afraid I don't actually know that off the top of my head. So one thing's for sure, you can expect things to become more onerous, and that's something that we ought to be preparing for. So if we're not measuring currently, hence my recommendation, start measuring, start collecting the data and see how far below the current workplace exposure limit you actually are.
Thank you, Kathy.
Phil, can I add something to that, please?
Yeah.
We have seen across a series of different successful applications for authorization that the committees are increasingly, the RAC is increasingly adding monitoring conditions to the granting of any authorization, and they can be fairly stringent, and in a few cases they have been onerous conditions. So they can start requiring that there is, for any workplace that continues to use a substance or is that authorized to use a substance, that they have to meet certain types of monitoring requirements. So as Kathy has said, the more information that is provided up front, the less onerous those monitoring requirements are likely to be in practice once an authorization is granted, because the committee has greater faith that the use is within a reasonably or within controlled conditions to the extent that they can be. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Meg. Okay, next. I'm using cadmium and don't know if there are any alternatives available. How can I find out? We're into technical words. Steve Gaidos, are you there?
Yes, I am. Again, the first thing you should do is definitely respond to the IAEG W5 surveys, because if you do so, you will receive a summary of our report conclusions as well as a fact sheet to help you keep up to date with the latest developments for cadmium. But also you're encouraged to undertake your own research and ask your supplier and your OEM about cadmium alternatives. There is some information on alternatives or lack of alternatives, and it has already been submitted on cadmium compounds in association with the candidate listing of the substances. The other thing you can do is go on the website, go on the internet, and do a Google search, and just type in the term cadmium plating alternatives. Hit the search key. You'll see tons of information out there, things that are working, things that are not working. But it also is very important to remember that you must work with your customer and OEM before implementation to confirm that any alternative to cadmium meets the design performance requirements for that aerospace vehicle. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yes.
The next one. We have completed surveys with our immediate suppliers in our supply chain, but what about distributors of plated products such as bolts, fasteners and washers for assembled components? David.
Yes, good question. I think in Kathy's presentation, it did touch on this, that distributors, although not directly or legally obliged, have quite an important part to play here. And we would expect them to pass that or to communicate those uses and information back up the supply chain. That's possibly easier said than done, but you know, keep pressing them, keep communicating with them.
I think I would add to that, if you have the names of any distributors that you know who you think would benefit from the survey that we're doing, or the survey itself would benefit from the information they provide, if you give those contact details to RPA as an independent company, then they will include them in the survey and send the survey to them. Okay. Right, the next question. How do you guarantee that information is kept confidential when undertaking your supply chain mapping activities? How very apt. RPA.
Hi. RPA has very significant experience in undertaking very wide consultation activities, both for industry clients and for the authorities. So we are very conversant with the ins and outs of asking for information an appropriate manner. We will certainly ensure that all information we receive from the supply chain is collated, anonymized, and reported back in an aggregated format to the IAEG, so that individual responding information cannot be deciphered. Wherever we are uncertain how we can use the information we have collected, we will certainly go back to the person who has submitted the information to clarify how the information can be actually be used. And as appropriate, we use encryption techniques and company-specific passwords, and we have internal processes to store data supplied by individual companies separate, so that it is not accidentally shared with anybody else. We're also happy to enter into non-disclosure agreements with companies if this is necessary, and we have done this many times in the past, and we're happy to do so again.
Thank you very much, Panos. Next, how long does the overall survey process take? How much of my time will this take? Erin, you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Phil. So as Kathy had indicated in her presentation, we will be disseminating both an initial and a follow-up questionnaire for cadmium and CAD compounds within the next few weeks. Workgroup 5 worked to streamline these questions to try to minimize the amount of time it was going to take you to answer them. And the initial questionnaire focuses on basic information concerning your company's classification, verifying your uses of cadmium, and then ensuring that we have the correct follow-on contact details. And we expect that this should not take longer than 10 minutes to complete. Those that answer positively that you do in fact have CAD uses will receive a follow-up questionnaire that's slightly more detailed, but will still only contain 10 questions that focus on the identification of particular uses and the associated parameters of those uses.
Thank you, Erin. I think we have one more. Oh no, I've got another one coming in here. In case of uses case under authorization after the sunset date, how are exposition for workers requirements defined? By risk of exposition or by a threshold limit? Are such requirements described in the CSR for each substance? Kathy?
I don't know if I've got this right, but if I have, I think what you mean is that so the sunset date has passed and we have got a use that is not in the CSR, and you're interested in knowing how is that going to be treated in the authorization? How will that be covered in the authorization? And I think the short answer to that is that it won't, because an authorization only applies to the particular uses that are defined within it. It is not expandable to cover other uses. It has to be the ones that are there. And also it's specific to the supply chain that has applied for it. So if a upstream company has applied for it, only those uses that company ultimately supplies to through distributors or whatever, to the end users, and the end users that have put the information in to the socioeconomic analysis, only that chain is covered. I'm not sure if that covers what you're asking, but if it does, great. If not, please expand on it some more, and as we've said before, put that information into Tom and we'll give you a fuller answer.
I think that there's a bit in there as well about are there limits within the authorization that they then have to adhere to those limits?
Yes, there are.
And the answer to that is yes, there are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We're just about done now, I think. One final question. What can be done now to prevent cadmium compounds being added to Annex 14?
The answer to that is only by provision of evidence that risks are being adequately controlled already. So we need information from people who are using the chemical to be provided to us so we can put together a case to say, don't require authorization, we already have adequate control, and here's the evidence. if we do not have the evidence, nothing will stop the substance from being added. So, lovely.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank you all for your questions. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and also all of the panelists for their input, and RPA as well for facilitating the event for us. A recording of this webinar will be made available soon on the IAEG website, and we will include in there a transcript of the questions and the answers. As this is our first webinar of this type for Workgroup 5, we'd appreciate your feedback. So if you could send this back to Tom, his email was the one that was sent out with the invite, tom.bursich@rpalimited.co.uk. I'd very much appreciate it, thank you. Many of you will be receiving our supply chain survey on Cadmium and its compounds soon, and I do encourage you to respond. Thank you all very much.